Well, here we are. We are on week number, let me check real quick. Looks like week number 7. And we're going to be discussing the Penal Code, specifically Chapter 6 this week. So, for this week, what I'd like you to do, and I will post it or attach a copy of Chapter 6 of the Penal Code in your assignment this week, I'd like for you to read it. And what we're doing is we're talking about the general principles of criminal responsibility. We talk about and we hear things like, ignorance of the law is no excuse, and things like that. And when we get into the penal code, there are different ways and different culpable mental states. Remember that, culpable mental states that are listed in Chapter 6 of the Penal Code. And basically, what that means is that there's a mindset that a person goes into when they commit certain criminal acts. It could be by act, it could be by omission. So there's just a lot in the Penal Code. And if you look at your Penal Code and your books that you have, your law books, you'll see that it's compared to some other laws. It's really not as thick as some of the others, but it kind of lays the framework, so to speak, for laws that you'll probably come in contact with, or criminal acts that you'll probably come in contact with when you're out there on the street as a patrol officer. The culpable mental states are intentionally, knowingly, recklessly, and with criminal negligence. Now, here's what I want you to understand. Even though intentionally and knowingly appear to be the more, what's the word I'm looking for? Probably the acts that will require more thought than recklessly and criminal negligence. One thing I want you to understand, they go from higher to lower. However, even with criminal negligence and intentionally committing a criminal act, you still have to prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden of proof is no different. The burden of proof is the same for all laws, no matter what the culpable mental state is. For example, let's say that you had a person, we'll use the criminal homicide statute. Let's say that a person commits murder. That case would still have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And then criminal negligence, criminally negligent homicide, which is the lower of the actual homicide statutes, that case would still have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay? So even though there are the elements of that offense might not require, say, for example, criminally negligent homicide, that particular offense wouldn't involve a greater thought process to occur. However, they are still, all those cases, like with any other case in the criminal justice system, has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's what I want you to keep in mind as you look at these laws. When you're looking at it, I want you to look at it through the lens of beyond a reasonable doubt. What I'd like for you to do also this week while you're reading Chapter 6, I want you to understand and look for the differences in the different culpable mental states. I want you to know the difference between intentionally and knowingly, and I want you to know the difference between recklessly and criminal negligence. Now, here's the trick to doing that. Intentionally and knowingly, look for the key words and phrases that make those different, and then look at recklessness and contrast it with criminal negligence, and look at the things that make that different. If you do that, it will help you come to a better understanding. For example, let's go with recklessness and criminal negligence. All right. A person acts recklessly or is reckless with respect to circumstances surrounding his conduct or the result of his conduct when he is aware of but consciously disregards a substantial and unjustifiable risk that the circumstances exist or the result will occur. All right? The risk must be of such a nature and degree that its disregard constitutes a gross deviation from the standard of care that an ordinary person would exercise under all the circumstances as viewed from the actor's standpoint. Now let's look at criminal negligence. A person acts with criminal negligence or is criminally negligent with respect to circumstances surrounding his conduct or the result of his conduct when he ought to be aware. Notice the difference. He ought to be aware of a substantial and unjustifiable risk that the circumstances exist or the result will occur. The risk must be of such a nature and degree that the failure to perceive it constitutes a gross deviation from the standard of care that an ordinary person would exercise under all the circumstances as viewed from the actor's standpoint. Even though that verbiage is the same, you need to look at the sentence prior to that and talk about, and look at the difference between recklessness and criminal negligence. Also do that with intentionally and knowingly. And then when we get into 604, we talk about causation, conduct, and results, and what makes criminal responsibility. We hear things about, well, a person was criminally insane or was insane at the time that they committed the offense, so maybe they can't be held criminally responsible. In my experience, when I was working at the DA's office as an investigator there, we had two young men that went into a local establishment and committed aggravated robbery, went back the next night, committed the same offense. These guys met in a mental health institution, and both of them were diagnosed as having schizophrenia. They both got the maximum sentence because the question became whether or not they knew right from wrong. Evidence was presented in the trial. The jury believed that even though they did have mental health issues, they did know the difference between right and wrong, and they're both they're still in prison. So when we talk about insanity and things like that, there are some other things that come into play. So don't be so quick to believe that, well, if a person can prove that they're insane or whether they get away with particular offenses. That's where the culpable mental states come into play. So you really need to read this week, come to an understanding. In your discussion board, I'm going to ask you to answer, some questions specific to the reading this week. Look at those and discuss it, with your classmates and things like that. I hope that you guys are having a great week. I hope you had a good week last week. Next week, we are going to be discussing more in the Texas Penal Code, and we'll be going over some definitions. And we'll talk more about that next week as we move along. So anyway, I hope that everybody has a great week, like I said, this week, and that things go well for you. Don't forget, this is not the only class that you have, I'm sure, for most of you. So also make sure that you keep up with your other classes. One of the things that I would like for you to challenge you to do, and it helped me, in my academic career, so to speak. What I started doing is even if I was taking a history or a government class along with, say, a philosophy class or even a science or math class, I would look for the common thread that ran through all those courses. I challenge you to do that. It'll just make you a better student, and it'll also help you during your academic career. That way it won't make you compartmentalize, and it'll kind of help you to get into the flow of things if you understand what your education is all about and what your goals are as a student. So anyway, that's all I have this week. Have fun, and I'm looking forward to reading your discussion post.